I'm sure there will be other people joining us. Well, I've talked to most of you, and I've introduced myself to most of you, but if I haven't, my name is Roberto Rocco. I'm an associate professor in spatial planning and strategy at the Department of Urbanism in this faculty. And I'm one of the organizers of this conference. So why did we decide? So first of all, I would like to assure you that we prepared this conference with great care. And in order to do that, we organized a pre-conference in Addis Ababa, to which we invited a number of African scholars from around the continent to ask them what are the topics that you think we should address in this conference. So, and our ultimate goal is to understand what is it that we have to teach to students here in order to make a positive impact, not only in Africa, but in the Global South in general. I myself, I'm from Brazil, so I'm a bit familiar with problems of urbanization in the Global South. But Africa has some very particular challenges. I just wanted to introduce why do we have a track on informal urbanization? And what do I mean by that? What we mean by informal urbanization in our department. There's a lot of debate, and I'm not here to define what's informal and what's formal. I think that's a huge debate that is being had everywhere, and people are losing sleep over what is formal and what is informal. Obviously, formal and informal are always intertwined, and they don't exist in isolation. Nothing is completely formal, nothing is completely informal. But for the effects of this session, we are going to look at forms of urbanization that happen in weak institutional environments, where local governments and national governments have weak, so to speak, capacity to plan, right? So I'm talking from the point of view of a planner. So I'm a planner, unfortunately. And I am looking at places that don't do planning like in Europe. But that's most of the world, right? So it's a very complicated discussion. Every year we have a huge event here talking about confronting informality, and that's organized by our students. I have this booklet. I have a few copies if anyone is interested, but this is available online. And every year we make a huge debate on ways, policies, designs, projects to address informal urbanization in the Global South. And we invite quite a few people. It's really quite interesting. Sorry, guys, I'm a bit ill, so I'll be coughing a lot. And another thing I would like to introduce and invite you to read, really it's a bit of a self-promotion now, but that's what it is. I have recently launched this book, which I edited with Jan van Ballegoyen. It's called The Routledge Handbook on Informal Urbanization. And it is a collection of 25 cases around the world. Unfortunately, I don't have Ethiopia, but I will in the next edition. 25 cases around the world where people from these cities, they describe what informal urbanization means in that particular context. So we have, for example, a chapter on Jerusalem, and we have a chapter on Lima and Sao Paulo and several African cities. And that's the way that I found to really discuss informal urbanization in context, because it does mean different things in different contexts. And I was losing my sleep really trying to say, okay, well, this is informal here, but it's not informal there. Most of urbanization in Africa happens in an informal way, and so does it in Latin America in many cases. But the main question that we had for this book, I don't know if you're interested, but this is my introduction, right? I have to introduce the session. The main question that we had for this book was something that I was really quite frustrated about. Is that in architectural schools we have a lot of scholars and people discussing slums in a very romanticized way. So people look at slums from Europe, and there is a little bit of poverty porn going on. So people are fascinated by the grassroots power of organizing their own spaces. And I think that's really something we should look at, and it's really important to understand, and to understand how people build their own cities with their own hands, right? However, these people generally leave aside problems of democratic exclusion and democratic deficit. So the problem of rights. If a citizen in a certain country has access to some services and quality of life, why shouldn't other citizens from that same city have the same access? So I'm not saying, please don't misunderstand me, I think it's very important to look at informal urbanization and understand the force, the strength, the power of people building their own cities. This is really important. And also from a more formal point of view, what kinds of forms we have emerging from these unplanned settlements, which are sometimes much. If you have been to a slum in Latin America, you think, whoa, actually the city sucks and the slums are great, because they are really interesting. And people have a community life, and they help each other, and these are very important things. Next to that, there are things related to rights, inclusion, and democratic deficit that we need to discuss as well, right? So I'm not attacking anyone, I'm just saying, okay, there are other things we also need to discuss. On that happy note, so I hope we will have a good discussion here. What I propose to the speakers is that everybody has a PowerPoint, and everybody is going to present, so it's very important, but that we feel comfortable to, okay, we give our presentations, let's talk informally, and then we can discuss a little bit about ideas that pop up, right? And okay, on that happy note, I will introduce our first speaker, Stephanie Briers, or Briers, how do you pronounce it? Briers, who is a PhD. She's from South Africa, I know, and she's doing a PhD in ETH, right, in Switzerland. So thank you. The floor is yours. Oh, I forgot to mention, there is this book that I showed you. There is a website. It's called informalurbanization.com, and it explains what the book is. So, yeah, you don't have to buy it, but please look at the website.
Great. Is this on, actually?
It is on, apparently.
Okay.
It's for the people who are watching at home.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming and listening to us all speak. I have the honor of being first and the scary task of being first. So I am doing my PhD in architecture at the ETH Zurich, based within an institute called the Institute for Science, Technology and Policy. And actually, this institute is completely interdisciplinary. So within my research group, called the Urban Research Incubator, I'm the only architect. So that is very important when, keeping in mind when I'm presenting this work that I've kind of largely broadened my horizons from, purely architecture background, and I was practicing as an architect before I started my PhD, to really working not only interdisciplinary, but very much transdisciplinary. So the research that I'm doing is all about public lighting in informal settlements and how we can improve public lighting in informal settlements. This informal settlement that you see on this photograph is called Marikana Informal Settlement, which is in Cape Town. And this photograph I took as I'm flying in, and it's sort of right below the flight path, which is already problematic because it means very difficult access to services. You cannot put electricity in, lighting is a huge problem, etc., etc. So we know that with rapid urbanization comes a huge backlog in infrastructure. You know, we all know that apartheid, the end of apartheid really reinforced this rapid urbanization, of course, because there was some very strict controls on who was allowed and who was able to access cities during apartheid. So this is the classic apartheid Group Areas Act of the City of Cape Town. But then when you look at this and you look at how actually public lighting also reflects the apartheid plan, this is today, well, 2011 census, you can see Cape Town is still very segregated. And if you then look at public lighting and how public lighting is really defining that segregation even further, this map is the public lighting data made available by the City of Cape Town's open data portal. And you can see the red dots are what the City of Cape Town and what I will refer to as high mast lighting. And the yellow dots are conventional street lights. So just to pan back to the apartheid plan, and you can see Khayelitsha is where, you know, the apartheid plan black area, and today this is 2017 data, and you can see that public lighting is really still defining that area. So in 30 years, nothing's changed. This beautiful photograph by the late David Goldblatt shows high mast lighting being implemented in the late apartheid era, and today, this is my photograph, you can see nothing much has changed. It's still the predominant source or predominant solution of public lighting. And it comes with many, many problems. It's a symbolic representation of the apartheid government, but it also has some very technical problems, like the very dark shadows, as you can see on this photograph, that is cast by high mast lighting, and it's really just an ineffective public lighting solution. Another problem, of course, things like if one light goes down, the entire community is left in darkness. So this has come to the attention by most people in Cape Town, including an NGO that I'm collaborating with called the Social Justice Coalition, where they have started standing up and saying, you know, there needs to be change. But this is not the topic really of conversation today. This is just, does the sound work? I don't know how, but anyways, this is a night walk / protest that the Social Justice Coalition organized to raise an awareness of the dire need for more effective public lighting in Cape Town's townships and informal settlements. But you know, what does this really mean for everyday life and the way that people experience life in these areas with predominantly high mast lighting or no lighting? This is just a very rough map showing, you know, the amount of service delivery protests in relation to the amount of high mast lighting, and you can see there is quite a strong correlation. The reason why in the city centre of Cape Town, which is where the harbour is, there's so many protests there is because that's, you know, where the City of Cape Town's offices are. So of course people protest there. And how are people experiencing this kind of lighting on a daily basis? And that is really from the real beginning point what I had to try and find out in my research before trying to make any kinds of solutions for this applied research project. So the real question that I'll be discussing today is what are nighttime experiences and what is the role of public lighting in everyday life in informal settlements? And then what methods can we use, and can iterative and experimental methods serve to capture and transfer these daily experiences and perceptions into something that we refer to as scientific knowledge, which is something that I'm hugely struggling with, if I have to be honest. So, you know, what does this mean? And what does this mean to science? And how can one really speak about your experience and then make some concrete conclusions about it? So, this is just some classic theory that, there's some huge issues with understanding participants in your research, their experiences, the constructions that they present to you, and then as the researcher you make certain constructions and eventually you get to some form of, I guess, scientific knowledge. And with these levels of constructions that happen, what can you do to really ensure that you come to some conclusions that are reliable? So as a result, I've been kind of forced to use an iterative process of methods, trying to find out, seeing what gaps they're presented, feedback loop, finding a new method, closing some of those gaps, and so on and so forth. So today I will be presenting 3 of those methods, looking at individual perceptions of public lighting, collective perceptions, and a preference study. So for the individual perceptions, I used a method called a participatory photo interview, where each participant gets a camera. I worked with 8 people of differing ages and genders, and they go out and photograph their daily experience of life, public lighting, and at nighttime. And these photographs are really incredible and really showed mainly that there's a huge fear of nighttime. It wasn't surprising at all, especially this method was carried out in Marikana, where there is no public lighting at all. So daily experiences are just absolute fear, and it's really a crime-ridden community. So these are some of the photographs. A lot of the photographs were also taken during the day because participants were too scared to take photographs at night. So this is illegal electrification that you can see on the floor. And that was a major concern for people too, was just the danger that they were under. So some of the reflections on this method was, the method was a huge stimulator of dialogue. It was really incredible. It is a time-consuming method, but the quality of those interviews, each interview lasted about an hour, where participants could choose their photographs, and they really felt, in a weird way, removed from their life, because they were presenting a photograph to someone as if it was one step removed from their own personal life, and that level of confrontation that happens when you're just sitting in a normal interview was no longer there so much. It was also quite difficult to control data collection though, because a lot of people are facing such huge issues that public lighting isn't always at the forefront, or not necessarily in the moment that they're taking those photographs. So some of the findings that this method presented was that there was just no public lighting in Marikana. So that's already a gap. You can't really find out much about the public lighting there. And that there was this huge fear attributed to nighttime and darkness. And nighttime activities always had negative connotations. Almost every single interview, if you ask people what do you do at night, or what do people do at night, it always had some kind of negative connotation. And participants really spent as little time outside as possible. So with this, because there was such an individual perspective, I realized that it was necessary to do a more collective perspective through a workshop. So these photos then got used again, and a new set of participants, this time 20 people from different informal settlements in Khayelitsha, got to review these photographs and write their thoughts on the photograph, and then they got to endorse each other's thoughts by sticking little sticky notes. And these are all kind of experimental methods that have sort of been borrowed and combined. And here you can see some of those. This was then followed by a session of cognitive mapping, where the participants, after looking at the different photographs, could then draw their own neighborhood and their sort of feelings about their neighborhood at night. And a lot of, this guy who drew this drawing spoke in a very metaphorical way about darkness and about, their area being covered by a cloud of darkness, not just because of the light, but just because of basically the lack of services and the undignified manner in which he is forced to live every day. And this is his, I don't know how to pronounce, oh, there we go. So this is him presenting his virtual reality and then completing a follow-up text survey and leaving. And so you have this kind of balance of in-depth interviews and then and then the more quantitative stuff that.
Yes, we have a question. What is the role, or do institutions play a role
within public? So yes, I mean the City of Cape Town provides public lighting. There is a kind of difficulty because the City of Cape Town's policies say that they should only provide public lighting on roads and streets. And so what does the City of Cape Town define as a road and a street? Do they define an informal road as a road? And so, yes, they are obliged to intervene, but it's very complicated. Their policies are really kind of outdated, and a lot of the time they are lighting in ways that are trying to loophole around their own strict and kind of straight-jacketed policies, like not being able to light on a private property. So they put high mast lighting on the periphery in the road to shine into a private property, rather than trying to find a different solution. Or they cannot use two different types of lighting in any environment. It's called a dual lighting policy. So if you have high mast lighting in an area and you want to change it to street lighting, you would then have to remove all the high mast lights to put street lights in. And this is something that's preventing any change from happening, and it's a huge problem. So yes, they do intervene, but they are not doing so successfully, hence the protest action that's begun to take place since about 2017 now. Yeah. Why informal settlements exist. I mean, that's a difficult question. So, like I said in the beginning, the apartheid government had very strict land policies of who was allowed to live in cities and who was not. They had pass controls, and if you were black, you had to use a pass book, and you were only a migrant labor or considered to be a temporary citizen, or no, not a citizen, a temporary person living in a city. So with the demise of apartheid, everyone had access to a city, so there was a huge influx in people moving to cities, understandably. And with that, the apartheid government also left the new democratic government with huge debt. So there was a large debt backlog that needed to somehow be recovered. And basically, the democratic government inherited a huge amount of problems with the insurgence of loads of new people into the city and a massive debt that they had to somehow try and catch up. In South Africa, I guess those are the two very big reasons why informal settlements exist. No, not fast urbanism and poverty. I think it's got to do with never allowing certain people access to a city, and then you allow certain people access to a city, and suddenly you have to provide services that have never been provided for so many new people. So I don't think it's as simple as fast urbanism and poverty. I think it's much more in depth than just those two things, especially in the context of South Africa. I think it's a much more complex problem than just that.
Do we have one last question? Yes, okay. Sorry, this is often we find this traditional lighting gender biased. Did you carry out any interviews, surveys of women's jobs to what their perception of lighting could be?
So with any survey that I do or any interview that I do, I'm always balancing out males and females. The NGO that I'm working with, Social Justice Coalition, often gather my participants for me and help me with that. And what I find is I often have like 60% women that come, because I don't know, generally in South Africa women are a bit more active in participation, yeah. So yes, there's a definite, men tend to use the public space and the public realm at night much more than women, and there's a definite inequality in access to public space by males and females.
It would be interesting to see if you did a simulation of what would be an ultimate criteria.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah.
Suggestion.
So that's the end goal of this research would be to do an applied. It's a research project where we'll be implementing lighting in an area with 850 houses, and so I guess you should watch this space.
Stephanie, we have to move on. Sorry, Stephanie, thank you so much, because not only you contribute to the academic discussion, but there are several students here, and I think they are inspired to see your methods and to see how you deal with people. So thank you so much. Our next presenter is Vincent. Is he here? Yes. Vincent, you have to forgive me because your name is so complicated to pronounce. I am ashamed. You will tell us. We have an issue with the microphone.
Goes directly to the
yeah.
not to the whole room.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I don't know how to fix that. I only work that.
Okay, but at least it works for the video.
Yeah, for the video is working. And I think that everyone can.
Yeah, I think it's okay. But he asked me to get another mic, so I thought something was wrong. I don't know. Sorry to disturb you.
Arguably, it's the largest conglomerate of open-air markets in the Sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, struggling with poor infrastructure and public utilities. The markets in these cities are approximately about more than 6 million people, which is a total of Nigeria population. Of course, you can see part of the problem mentioned is a typical city in some parts of the streets in some parts of the city. However, Onitsha is also, I would like to introduce it within the Nigerian context. You can see different, coming from climatic to even the different economic shifts that we have. What the striking thing is also, because Nigeria is a very interesting situation. It has, if you look at the complexity of the place, it has more than 252 different ethnic nationalities. But then there's also, there is a historical and political process. So within these cities, it started with the military cantonments. And of course, some of the laws that we have concerning urban development in Nigeria is more like a modifications of this colonial history. Of course, now it's shifted from rather an elitist approach towards urban development. However, but then, of course, these are some two hypotheses that I'm trying to use as a including the framework of my research. That the socio-cultural support systems and the dominant hierarchies within, they actually give rise to territorial organization and morphology of urban markets, whether informal or formal. I'm going to get to that later. So you also have the prevailing economic systems and material flows networks within a hierarchical definitions. There are also some basis for the collectivity in this market.
Listen, I'm afraid you need to use the microphone because there are people watching at home.
Okay.
And you can hear.
So can I?
The microphone doesn't work for us.
But it works. Okay, great. Thank you. So if you look, for instance, this is a section of a market in 1962 in Onitsha. And this one is 2012. This is one unit of the markets in this city. Currently, there are 39 of them. So this is basically about 1.7 square kilometers. But if you also look, there are also interesting things. So this is also 1962, but the same process is still going on, even though more than 50 years. If you look at the growth, you could see how the city quickly really expanded. And of course, also very crucial within the material flows in Nigeria. Now, this is basically here. Yeah, this is what is known as within the state government as Onitsha, but you could see it's more like there's also different expansions, and that is actually really like swallowing other parts of the city. And so if you look at the spread of the markets in this city, so this is basically how it is. So this is where it started. So I'm really looking in this area. So I've been able to identify 2 case studies here, so which I'll talk about later. So, but then also, it's not like disjointed locations of market, where in this city, you basically feel like the whole city is a market. So like, for instance, in this case, you could see even the scale and the relationship of how it is. So in major axes, so where you have the expressway is basically where you don't have the presence of this market. So my current a little bit understanding of markets in most cities of sub-Saharan Africa is it symbolizes a convergence of cultural and socioeconomic realities shaped by the interplay of material flows and contextual forces. They are primeval urban elements of human settlements and with attributes of pluralities, collectivities, and material flows in cities. Of course, these markets provide economic, social, politically networked infrastructure system in the city. So these are like some images of the markets, as you can see. However, this has been interpreted as informal. Of course, I try to look at the different schools of thought on informality, from the dualists, and then you have the legalists, voluntarists, and the structuralists. Of course, the recent one, which is I find quite very interesting, is the inclusionists. However, they all focus also on the same discussion. Like they focus on the dichotomy, there's informal and formal. And looking at also some epistemological differences to development, you have maybe looking at a different way of looking at this. So you could see, in a sense, there are all actions, well-intentioned actions that have been going on to make these cities better, but still things don't have to change. But then, of course, the question comes, if the dominant economic systems in these cities, especially in Onitsha, for instance, and of economic production, they are largely designated as informal. So what is informality, and why is it informal? And whose definition of informal? Because the current definition that the way I see it now, it puts the order. So if I am in the government system, basically I see it as the order. I haven't actually recognized what the problem is. For instance, this is a typical street within this market. This is Headbridge Market. Now, you have the banks, you have the businesses, you have where people are living. But then also, perhaps this could throw in light in this, is you have this situation where there is a commercial bank and there is a telecommunication outlet. However, if you look down, you can see somebody in the kiosk. And the person that is really serving these two different businesses, or part of these two different formal businesses, is actually considered to be informal. So you see this in different variations. If you look at the government hierarchy in the city, so you can have, there's a relationship where you have with the market is where you have the tax and the inland revenue. But if you look at the self-organized mesh that is within the market, so of course the transport system in the city is owned privately by the people that live there and the business people, the merchants, and then of course the markets and the neighborhood. So there's a different kind of a relationship that is completely different from what is supposed to be the formal. And they also, these organizations here, they also part of the processes that I already mentioned before, like for instance, the All Matter, which is Onitsha Amalgamated Trade Association, started this in order to find a way to protect themselves from what is supposed to be intrusionary from the developed hierarchy, which is also related to also the transportation, because they had to protect their goods all the way from Lagos to Onitsha. By the way, the only active ports which also has this political history in Nigeria is Lagos. So all the goods that are coming to this Onitsha, which is really very important for trade, spaces. So in this case, I decided to look at two case studies, and then the criteria that I used is because these are the biggest. The first one is the growth trajectories. So some started as organic market and then of course expanded where there are additions, whereas the other ones are purpose built, and so the expansion is really vertical and is not horizontal. So the second one is the size. I'm trying to look at the biggest of the two, and then the third one is the territorial spread. So the second case study is limited, it's bound within the perimeter, whereas the other one is really going into the city. So there is no boundary between where there is market and where there is not. And so you have the first one, so you could see this is basically the yellow part is where you have what is known to be the controlled perimeter, but then when you go into this part of the city, it's also market, and it's even considered the larger part of the market. So these are some images that you can use to have a look at what is going on. I have some videos here, but because of okay, I'll quickly run. And then the second one is also, you have the informal part in the perimeter, so to speak. So you can see, basically, these are some images. And then, not to forget about the idea of collective spaces. So now, in this case, I'm into some kind of some challenges, because the collective space, how it has been defined here by some of the protagonists, is a space that is not semi-public private. It's basically accessed and shared. And it's not a space that it's not private. It's a space that encompasses all of them. But then this is why I would like to have throw it open to see how maybe the process of how I can be able to go about to look at what collective service group is basically in different aspects of this market, and then it's also within where you have the market. the LGA, and also the state. So they have different representatives within this structure. So you can quickly see they have their offices, they're very organized, they have their, and the ones they need to produce something, where you have a factory that they can produce something and sell also within this market. And the ones that are within the residential units, where especially those places that you don't have a boundary between what is the market and where the city is. And these are the latest ones, where you have a combination of offices and also the markets. And you have different configuration mechanisms here. So you have the ones that are completely different from where they sell. So especially these ones, there's just representatives, and where they have their goods are in different locations of you pay, and then you have your goods delivered. And also, of course, different configurations. But basically, the ground floor is where you have the markets, and then the upper floors is where you have the offices. Then quickly also, the social organizations are not according to the buildings. They are organized according to the lanes, which I'm still trying to look on the implications of this. Lastly on this is you have the unit fragmentations of, for instance, within, if the enumerations that the government make, you have, perhaps they would say they have only 2 shops, but then within 6 months, they have a subdivisions of this because they don't want to be exposed in this. So in just trying to look at all these, I've been able to put side by side. You have the social configuration, you have the spatial configuration previously, and then now you have even the recent, the economic, so to speak, configuration. So there's a similarity in